Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Objective Health. So I'm going to be your host today. My name is Elliot, and I'm joined with Doug. It's just
Hello,
us two.
everyone. Just us two, the bro show.
Yeah, this is the total bro show today. So, pertinent topic that we're going to be talking about, actually. It's the topic of soy boys. So, for those who aren't familiar with the concept of a soy boy or the idea of soy boys is basically kind of like a meme that was spread around a couple of years ago that gained some traction on social media and kind of upset a couple of people, I think.
A couple.
And so basically what soy boy is referring to is the feminization of males in our modern world, and how the typical kind of image of a male or the role of a male in society has kind of changed in recent years, in the past couple of decades. Well, for one, we see that testosterone levels have declined significantly, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit later. But the concept of a soy boy is essentially the conglomeration of all of these feminizing factors to produce what appears to be a male, but is not strictly male in the genuine sense, if that kind of makes sense. So according to the Urban Dictionary, we have a very good definition, actually. And so this is: a soy boy is slang used to describe males who completely and utterly lack all necessary masculine qualities. This pathetic state is usually achieved by an overindulgence of emasculating products and or ideologies. The origin of the term derives from the negative effects of soy consumption has been proven to have on the male physique and libido. The average soy boy is a feminist, non-athletic, has never been in a fight, will probably marry the first girl that has sex with him, and likely reduces all his arguments to labeling the opposition as Nazis. And we see this today. Isn't this quite familiar, Doug?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's basically what kind of right-wingers started calling SJW men, basically, like saying that, the male feminist is kind of the typical kind of soy boy. The idea that, he's not really acting like a man and basically being subservient and, the yes dear kind of person, or it's kind of like, in a way, it is just a meme, right? It's just there's a stereotype. But the thing is, there's no question that there's some validity to it, I'd say, because there's certainly this type of person exists and seems to be becoming more prevalent too.
Yeah, indeed. And this is really what we're going to try to flesh out a little bit on the show. Hopefully, if we can kind of, because it's kind of whipped up a lot of feathers. People have there's been some backlash, and people have cited evidence saying, no, soy consumption, for one, soy consumption is in no way implicated in the decline in testosterone levels, even though we know that that's happened. But soy is not involved, and all of these other factors are merely coincidental. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to briefly take a look at whether soy is in fact estrogenic or not. And I will preface that with yes, it is. And there's also lots of other things that we're coming into contact with. And this is particularly an important point, I think, if you're a male listening today, is that many of the environmental kind of toxins, some things that we are coming into contact with in our diet and in our lifestyle, are actually having a feminizing effect on the physiological level. And that physiology is intimately related with how we are kind of perceiving the world psychologically, our views on things. And we're kind of going to get into this a little bit in the show, and hopefully we can kind of reach some conclusions at the end.
Yeah.
But we'll see how that goes. So first of all, right, this concept, soy. Right. So there's a very popular kind of YouTuber. His name was Paul Joseph Watson. And he actually, he was one of the guys who kind of blew this up as well. He made a video about soy boys and cited some evidence, which was basically showing a correlation between soy intake and feminine qualities in males, but also animal research. And there's quite a lot of it showing that soy is having an estrogenic effect on the cellular level. So it means that it's actually having an effect whereby it's activating certain receptors inside cells to have the same effect that the hormone estrogen would have. And estrogen is, I mean, I don't want to call it a female hormone because it's present in both males and females, but it is very much more predominant in females. It's a critical component of the menstrual cycle. And so that's why we kind of refer to it as a female hormone. Anyway, so yeah, there's lots of research actually showing that by feeding male animals soy products, that you are actually having an effect where you're having this estrogenic kind of influence on the cell. And so there's been lots of people who've spoken about this in the past, but since this meme kind of came out, and I think even before then somewhat, there has been certainly quite a lot of backlash, particularly from people, vegans, vegetarians, and also I think from the big businessmen in agriculture. So there have been many kind of journal articles which have come out, supposed scientific studies, meta-analyses and whatnot, which supposedly disprove any link between soy consumption and feminization or estrogenicity. And so I just want to highlight, so there was one study, it was a meta-analysis and it came out not long ago, it's 2 years ago. If I can just find it here. And it's called, and this is one of the studies that many of the kind of advocates for soy, vegan YouTubers and these kind of things, they will typically cite these studies in support of the fact that soy is actually a part of a healthy, balanced diet and that we should all be eating more of it. And so it's called Soy and Health Update, Evaluation of the Clinical and Epidemiologic Literature. And basically what this is concluding is that there is no estrogenic effect of soy. Soy is perfectly healthy. There are no adverse consequences. In fact, it's very beneficial for things like cardiovascular health. But then what we do is we actually go down to the bottom of the study and we look at who was funding it. And if I can just scroll down here, it turns out that, oh, I've lost it. Right. Yeah. So the author of the study is the executive director of the Soy Nutrition Institute, an organization funded by the United Soybean Board and its soy industry members. So we can kind of get, we can safely say that this cannot be cited as evidence. There's another paper as well that whilst I was looking at the videos and kind of rebuttals of the soy estrogen argument, people claiming that there's no issues. There's another paper, clinical studies show no effect of soy protein or soy isoflavones on reproductive hormones in men, results of a meta-analysis. So this is basically coming out and saying that they looked at the evidence for soy protein isolates, so soy supplements and things, on male reproductive hormones to test whether there was any effect on testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, and all sorts of things. And they basically said that there's no connection whatsoever. But then if we go down to the bottom of this study as well, we see, okay, so who were they funded by? So the author is a doctoral student, received some funding from the Soy Nutrition Institute. Another one of the authors regularly consults for companies in the soy food industry. So,
yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, oh, it sounds completely trustworthy. I think that sounds like that's the God honest truth right there. I mean, it's hardly anything surprising, really. The fact that soy is like a lot of people don't really realize. They think of soy. They think of soy milk and tofu, and then that's about it. Thinking that if you don't eat those things, then you're not eating any soy. But they don't realize that the soy industry is massive, like billions of dollars massive, and there's soy in so much of processed food. Soy oil, soy protein isolates, so many additives and things like that are being derived from soy. Like it is everywhere. And if you're not making an effort to actually keep it out of your diet, you probably are eating it. Not even to mention the amount that's being fed to livestock. So like soy is huge. So the idea that they would have an interest in not letting any kind of negative effects of soy consumption get publicized is not surprising in the least. So, before you tell us we should be wearing tinfoil hats and crying conspiracy theory and all this kind of stuff, it really isn't surprising. And the fact that there is a significant amount of science out there that does show an estrogenic effect, and yet there's these studies coming out and saying, no, there isn't any, but they're sponsored by or funded by the soy industry. It's like, you got to take those kinds of things into account.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, as you've just said, just because you're not eating tofu doesn't mean that you're not consuming soy. I mean, if you look at practically any packaged food, especially in the United States, I mean, it's all soybean oil, soy textured, modified protein, starch, whatever they call it. Yeah. They'll rename it something. So it's a really prevalent thing. But then when we factor in, okay, so this is potentially having a very strong estrogenic effect. How is this affecting male physiology? Is this soy boy meme simply a meme, or is there something to this? And it would seem as though there might be.
Yeah.
So when we look at testosterone levels, so testosterone is it's known as the male hormone. Again, it's not technically correct because females do have some of it, but essentially it's more predominant in males. And so it is responsible for things like building the musculature, building the structure of the skeleton. But it also has effects on the brain. So it can testosterone is one of the main things which is driving the difference in neurodevelopment of the female and the male brain. Okay, so it's one of the primary factors which basically determines whether someone is going to have a female brain or a male brain. It's the testosterone, and that is going to basically formulate all kind of dig in neural pathways. It's going to have effects on the whole of the brain development, and essentially kind of shapes the male's perception of reality, or how they are perceiving reality. And there are certain kind of neural structures which are clearly different in males than they are in females. And it's hypothesized that this is actually at least partially responsible for some of the behavioral differences, the characteristic kind of male type behaviors that are displayed in children. For instance, if you give, and this kind of flies in the face of the politically correct kind of idea that males and females are fundamentally the same, and that it's merely social influences which shape us, which is complete nonsense. Because when you look at the neurobiology and how that maps with behaviors, boys will play with cars, children will play with dolls. Yeah, little girls will play with dolls. That's as a general rule that there are kind of biological underpinnings for this, and everything that comes after that in the adolescence and in the kind of adult way of behaving. And so when we factor in that we in the past sort of 50 odd years, because before that, maybe 60, 70 years, before the 1950s, we weren't coming into contact with so much soy, with so many of the other factors, which we're going to talk about later. It's like, okay, these past couple decades, we have just been exposed to so many of these gender bending chemicals, these gender bending influences, surely that has had some effect on the way that males operate, the way that males kind of exist these days. When we look at testosterone, so testosterone since the 1970s, testosterone has been gradually declining each year.
Yeah. And lo and behold, we get to now, and suddenly there's the rise of this soy boy idea. The idea, you know, and I mean, you can see it around. Like we've said, there clearly is some validity to this idea that men are becoming more feminized in a lot of ways. And maybe one of the things, maybe we should back up a little bit and just talk about, you know, why does soy have this effect? And I mean, the reason that it's happening is there are substances in soy called phytoestrogens. And what that basically means is that they are certain compounds that mimic the effect of estrogen, mostly because their structure is very similar. So it will physiologically bind to estrogen receptors in the same way that estrogen does, and will actually compete for estrogen receptors. Now, phytoestrogens, that phyto meaning plant, so plant estrogens, they're not just found in soy, they are found in other things, but soy is like so much higher than almost anything else. I think flaxseed is up there as well, and sesame seeds as well, although the sesame seeds aren't as high. But the thing is that you don't eat, you know, like 6 ounces of flax seeds or sesame seeds in a sitting, right? So most of our exposure, if we're getting any, like, you know, there's a little bit in other nuts and seeds and stuff as well, but the amount of it is pretty minuscule. But soy is just, for some reason, for whatever reason, is like off the charts. So phytoestrogens, I mean, there's other places, as you know, Elliot alluded to before, where we're going to come into contact with these false estrogens, or these estrogen mimickers, and that's in Xenoestrogens, which basically just means estrogens coming from outside the body. And one of the places where we get a lot of this are from chemicals, like just man-made chemicals that are used in everything from plastics to food ingredients to soaps and disinfectants. It's just, it's surrounding us. It's all over the place. And again, it doesn't seem like it's a coincidence that, you know, once in around the 40s and 50s, when the kind of chemical industry really started to rise, and like more and more chemicals started getting created and put into our environment, it just seems naive to think that wouldn't have an effect on everybody, of course, but on men in particular. And certainly, I mean, I think that is what we're seeing.
Yeah, indeed. And on just on the topic of soy, I mean, there have been several, probably, I mean, I'd guess probably in the tens of thousands of cases of kind of adolescent gynecomastia, or adult gynecomastia, from the consumption or the overconsumption of soy milk. So babies who are put on soy milk formula, it's been estimated that they are getting the equivalent dose of estrogen as 2 to 3 birth control pills each day. And that's a lot. And you have to think, okay, when you've got a developing child, I mean, especially a male child, and they are literally 3 or 4 months old, and they are being pumped full of this stuff, which is essentially having the same effect as a female hormone. I mean, that is going to have such a disruptive effect on that whole child's development, in terms of their body is getting mixed messages all of the time. I mean, there's no case in nature when a baby would have that much estrogen.
No. But Elliot, you have to explain what gynecomastia is.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So gynecomastia being male boobs, male man boobs.
Moobs.
So yeah, the deposition of kind of fatty tissue and where the nipple is to basically, and this isn't just in obese people. So, it's typically associated with man boobs. He must be obese, but actually it's occurring in kind of seemingly fit and healthy individuals. They're relatively lean on every other part of their body, but they've got like a set of boobs.
Yeah.
And so it makes you wonder, what on earth is going on here? And it's no coincidence that the people who get this, generally, they drink soy milk.
Yeah. I mean, certainly there's other factors that could come into it, but I think that soy is a big one. And you mentioned Paul Joseph Watson before, and in his video he was actually just showing all these examples of people who were essentially the prototypical soy boy, making calls out for like male feminism and calling their opponents Nazis and all this kind of stuff, and then pulling up other tweets of theirs where it shows them like with their carton of soy milk, or like drinking soy milk or having their soy latte from Starbucks and stuff like that. So, I mean, obviously that's not like a strong case by any sense, but it's still nonetheless kind of funny examples that like, that there seems to be a correlation here.
Indeed. And it's very interesting. I'll just comment what you've just said, Paul Joseph Watson, because he also made a connection, another very interesting connection, actually, on kind of the prevalence of these overly feminine males who kind of tick all of the boxes, so to speak. We know that soy is estrogenic. We know that it can kind of increase feminization. We know it has a negative effect on testosterone. We also know that generationally speaking, or over the generations, testosterone has significantly declined and continues to decline. So the modern male kind of in their mid-20s is going to have much lower testosterone than their counterpart would have in the 1980s, okay? But there's a very interesting paper, and it's called Testosterone, Smiling, and Facial Appearance. And so it actually makes, it was a study done on testosterone and how basically what they were doing was they had a panel of judges, and they had the judges basically measure different men and their facial features and the way that they smiled. Okay, so what they found was that they found among men, the smiles of higher testosterone subjects showed less crinkling around the eyes and less upward and outward movement of the corners of the mouth. So basically that they, if you had high testosterone, you were less likely to crinkle your eyes when you smiled and actually open your mouth fully. Furthermore, they found that, there was, right, so a very strong or full zygomatic arch or zygomatic muscle contraction is negatively correlated with testosterone. Yeah, so basically, in simple terms, what they were saying was that guys who had really large kind of flamboyant smiles, like really large smiles, that they had lower testosterone. Whereas the guys who had higher testosterone had kind of much more subtle smiles and kind of straight faces. Now, it kind of, that it's just one study, but it kind of fits in with what you would call a stereotype, right? So of the kind of, manly, hunky guy who's, like frowning almost, with the broad chin and stuff. It's just what you think of as the kind of typical macho guy, isn't it? You don't really see him all smiling. And Paul Joseph Watson was basically making the correlation all of the people who kind of fit the bill for the soy boy, who also drank soy milk, when they took pictures, they also had these really large smiles.
Yeah. It kind of like, it seemed like, I mean, it kind of seemed just like a trend where they had this expression on their face with their mouth wide open and like smiling, and like, it's kind of like, you know, this study, I have to say, this study actually made me quite self-conscious, because I think I do have a very big smile and my eyes do tend to crinkle a lot. So it's kind of like, oh, maybe I'm a soy boy. I mean, I don't drink soy milk, but maybe I need to get my testosterone levels checked, because that actually does. But the thing is, I think the meme of it, and they called it, I can't remember what they called it, like the new male smile, like new spelled N-U, the new male smile, or the soy boy smile, or something like that. And it was just kind of this expression that they'd have on their face, that they were showing excitement and enthusiasm, where they're just kind of like. And there's like so many examples of these kinds of people with these kinds of smiles on their faces trying to be excited about something, like, you know, their soy milk or something like that. They're like, ah, and yeah. So I think, but it's really funny that it can be correlated back to this study that actually found that, you know, that people with lower testosterone, or men specifically with lower testosterone, will take on these facial features a little bit more. And it really does fit the stereotype, because that kind of expression is very sort of disarming, or sorry, not disarming, it's like disarmed. It's kind of like, it's non-threatening. It's very kind of like, look at me, I'm soft, I'm approachable, I'm very agreeable, and that sort of thing. It's very much the opposite of you know, somebody being like dominant and like asserting themselves, and, you know, not necessarily bad things. I mean, we can get into a discussion all about like the toxic masculinity thing, but just it does seem to conform to that kind of stereotype, that the idea that, you know, somebody who does have this bright broad smile is very non-intimidating, non-aggressive, soft, essentially. Soy boy.
I mean, it's just my personal experience, but ever since reading that study, you know, I've kind of been looking through on my social media, and it's kind of brought back some kind of memories as well. It seems to fit in with my personal experience. There are those males who are, I mean, they are more feminine. Some people are naturally just more feminine, or you know, perhaps they have wider kind of social networks which are predominantly female. You know, that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying they're soy boys, so to speak. But I would say that, you know, the more feminine males indeed typically present that image on pictures. That's just something that I have personally found. And so, yeah, again, so when we start factoring in, okay, so we've got soy. We know that is having a really feminizing kind of influence on people. There are these xenoestrogens as well. So it's not just coming from the food. I mean, it can be coming from what the food is packaged in, for one. So we have phthalates or phthalates. I think that's how I mean, this has been known for a very long time. There's various researchers who have actually come right out and said that these things should be banned. So phthalates are a type of chemical which are used in plastics, and they're to prevent like shattering. They're to provide it with bendiness and kind of malleability, so to speak. So like with a plastic bottle and a water bottle, that would have phthalates in, or like like a milk bottle or something. And so, you know, in our modern world, we are surrounded by plastic. Everything that we kind of consume is touched plastic at some point. So the chances are, I think most of the research studies have shown that the large majority of people are holding on to some amount of phthalates in their kind of adipose tissue, or circulating in the blood or in the urine or something. So it is there. It's been shown that phthalates are anti-androgenic, and testosterone is an androgen. So what this means is anti-testosterone, but it's also can be estrogenic as well. So
yeah,
in a similar way to a phytoestrogen, this one is a xenoestrogen, But what this means is it's basically acting on a very similar mechanism whereby it's kind of, acting on those estrogen receptors and having the same effect as the hormone would on the cell. So it's giving the cell these messages that there are elevated levels of female hormones and that the cells need to respond to that in some kind of way. And so, I mean, it's not only in plastics, but says drugs, nutritional supplements, binders, emulsifiers, gelling agents, stabilizers, lubricants, and dispersants.
Yeah.
And so they've not only been animal studies showing that phthalates can essentially like twist the gender of fish and of like I mean, in fish, I think that they can actually cause the fish to start producing eggs in their testicles.
Yeah.
So it was
talk
having
about gender bending. Jeez.
Yeah. And in rats, if I remember correctly, the phthalates were basically able to cause deformities, like physical deformities in the vas deferens, in the seminiferous tubules, in the testicles, basically like tanking sperm production. Yeah. So sperm production. And we know, aside from lower testosterone levels, sperm counts have tanked to what they were. They have tanked. And so this is another factor. And in fact, there was one really interesting study that I was looking at, and it was basically measuring the gender typical behaviors in children. Mm-hmm. And I can't see it right now. I may have to come back to that.
Well, just about the phthalates, just a general overview of what they've found with it. Like, it increased the incidence of undescended testes and other genital birth defects, abnormal testicular function, including a higher than average incidence of infertility in adult males. It's associated with changes in gender-specific behavior, such as exposed males choosing to play with traditionally boy-typical toys less often, which is probably the study that you were talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
So basically, boys not acting in a way typical of the way that boys act, like young boys. I mean, like you were saying earlier, it's like, there are behavioral differences between boys and girls at a very young age. They'll start to develop, and the fact is that boys typically will play in a more aggressive way. They like cars, they like guns, they like soldiers, that sort of thing, whereas girls tend to like dolls and stuff. And even when they try to enforce more gender neutral play, the boys will still play with, they'll take their doll, they've been given a doll, and they'll turn it into a gun and start using it as a gun. Or they'll start, playing with it in a very kind of more like aggressive kind of way, whereas girls will take their toy cars and start treating them, they make a little car family, and they start like having little social interactions between the cars. So it's like these kinds of things are kind of inset behaviors. These things aren't arbitrary, despite the trend now is to say that this stuff is all arbitrary and it's all just socially conditioned, that there's no biological basis to this sort of thing, but that's not the case. And when we see changes in that kind of thing, I mean, the SJWs would probably cheer on that sort of thing. Well, good, boys aren't playing with their typical boy-style toys, but this is actually quite disturbing that these kinds of changes are happening.
Yeah, indeed, because it makes you wonder, okay, well, how is this, if this has been established for many years and we have been kind of coming into contact with that for many years, then how is that altered or affected the kind of the way that men are because those men are now adults. Mm-hmm. The children who were initially exposed to these kind of chemicals, I mean, they're still there. It's more by the day, but essentially these males have grown into adults. So how has that had any effect? And then you start looking at the kind of madness that we see on the kind of social political level, and it makes you wonder. I mean, now, when I mean, when we're talking about things like transgenderism, something that was relatively, I mean, very uncommon just a couple decades ago. And there's lots of factors here, no doubt. I'm not just saying that it's gender bending chemicals, but when we kind of look at where we were 30, 40, 50 years ago, and then in today's world where we're in a climate that is essentially trying to normalize the idea of a biological male or female at a young age having sex change surgery. So actually having their genitals mutilated and then taking exogenous kind of hormones to be able to artificially try and transition to the opposite sex. And that is somehow, that has become so normalized now. And we're actually having kind of public health policy, laws and things, education, many different aspects of our kind of education society are really molding to this new phenomena, because it is a new phenomena. It's like everyone is kind of just forced to accept that this is the new norm. So why is this the case? You know, is the fact that actually human beings have exposed themselves to such crazy chemicals this past, you know, sort of half century, that actually, is it having some kind of a biological effect whereby it's skewing how we are perceiving our gender? Is that occurring in some people?
Yeah. And I think that one of the interesting things about it is that it's kind of lauded, like it's kind of like encouraged and looked at as a good thing. You know, the whole idea of this like toxic masculinity, and that male qualities are what are traditional male qualities are looked at as being bad, and that it's actually a good thing that men are becoming kind of more feminized, kind of softer, not aggressive, you know, passive. That's kind of being looked at as a good thing. And I find it really interesting, actually, because it's like there are certainly people out there who are decrying the lack of kind of male role models and male standards. Like, where are all the real men? Where have all the real men gone? You know, and it's like it's kind of like what's being rejected is the caricature of a man, right? Like the idea that he's aggressive, intolerant, grouchy, whatever, like. Those are kind of like, you know, warmongering, like that's considered, you know, toxic masculinity. But it seems like all the good traits of masculinity are kind of being thrown aside as well, and kind of it's encouraged softening of men. And yeah, I think that the exposure to all these, you know, estrogens is probably goes a long way towards explaining that. Explaining what exactly is going on there. But I just find it very curious that that there aren't a lot of people out there who are disturbed by this. It kind of seems like there's I mean, it does seem to kind of divide along political lines. You know, it seems like the left is much more into encouraging this sort of thing, and is much more likes the idea of more feminized men, whereas conservatives definitely seem to be more like, no, we need our man's man kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know, it's kind of crazy though.
Yeah, I often wonder. I mean, okay, so if we look at like the modern fashion shows, you know, it seems like there is a very, very real push to kind of tell us that this is the way that males should be behaving now. So I'll give you an example. So for instance, you know, I was looking at, I think it was the 2018 or early 2019 Fashion Week. And you know what it seems like? It seems like the male catwalk models, the large majority of them were in like traditionally female attire. Yeah. So you had short skirts, you had weird kind of like frilly bras, and just extremely feminine clothes. And then on the other hand, you had the opposite for females. So you had females, I mean, there were some in dresses, but I mean, some of them looked like they were designed to try and mimic guys. You know, it was really strange. And it seems like, okay, these ideas, you know, I mean, it even just seems like 10 years ago, this wouldn't have been so acceptable. You know, people would have kind of, I could be wrong, but I just feel like not long ago, people would have kind of outcried and said, what the hell is this? This is crazy. But now it seems like actually you have these ideas coming from up top, so to speak, but it's almost like the ground is already fertile. You know, the people are already kind of ready for that. And I think there's lots of factors involved there, like social, kind of ideological, and various things which kind of prime people to accept this kind of insanity. But ultimately, I think one of those is also the biological or physiological effects of these chemicals. Yeah. And that actually, I mean, right. So this is not a very politically correct opinion. And in fact, I really commend the authors of this paper. It's one called Transgender Associations and Possible Etiology. And so basically, they've kind of been brave enough to come out and look at the evidence and kind of say, look, in the past 20 years, transgenderism has gone up through the roof. Now, it's not only social factors, like social factors can't be the only thing involved here. They just can't be. They can't explain it. There's got to be some kind of underlying reason. There's got to be something that we can kind of look at to help us understand why on earth this is occurring, because it seems like it's, you know, it's just increasing ever more by the day. And so these scientists have they've reviewed the literature and they've come up with some interesting things. So, I mean, we've spoken about how about how certain chemicals or certain phytoestrogens in plants such as soy can have this kind of estrogenic effect. But in this paper, they're actually talking about other factors as well. So they do talk about the role of endocrine disruptors. And this is in, you know, quite a well-renowned scientific journal. And they say about how, you know, another working hypothesis involves the role of endocrine disruptors in transgender etiology. They hypothesized a role for endocrine disruptors, especially phthalates. Phthalates are present, blah, 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 blah. So what they're saying is that it's been suggested that these endocrine disruptors may actually affect the gestational environment. So the balance of hormones in the womb, in uterus. And it's very interesting because they were talking about how the brain and then the rest of the body will develop at different stages. So for instance, you can have the development of a female body, but then if at a certain point during the pregnancy, there is significant kind of exposure to endocrine disruptors, some kind of surge of testosterone, surge of estrogen or whatever, then it can actually, it's theorized, I don't think it's been proven, but it's theorized that actually you can have the development of one gender of the rest of the body, but then the development of the opposite gender of the brain and the nervous system. So you can essentially have a male body with a female kind of type brain in terms of its wiring, in terms of the way that it's structured and the way that it functions. And yet, so you've got the female brain born into the male body, and then with the fact that it's becoming so normal these days and quite frankly so easy to make the transition, it's highly possible that actually one of the reasons why we're seeing this is the fact that our hormones are completely skewed out the window because we're exposed to all this crap.
Yeah. And particularly the pregnant mothers being exposed to all this crap. It's like high exposure at the wrong time during the pregnancy could theoretically end up having this kind of effect. Now, it's very, like you said, it's very politically incorrect to kind of theorize in that way. But I mean, you know, we are objective health, and we try to be as objective as possible. And the fact that there is such a boom in this recently, in the rise of transgender, gender fluidity, all this sort of thing, like, you know, even 20 years ago, this was not happening. You know, it was a very rare thing. It was kind of the you know, 1 in a million, probably more, you know. So the fact that it has been, and I don't think you can just kind of say, oh yeah, it's trendy. Like, I think there's something more going on there. So I think that this theory is actually, there's some basis to it. It's not just kind of politically incorrect kind of, you know, theorizing.
Yeah, and in today's kind of social climate, you know, you can be slaughtered in the public eye for even making such a claim.
Yeah.
But that's not to say, you know, we're not in any way slating transgenders.
No.
We're saying that actually, you know, it's a very strong possibility, and it's unfortunate for everyone, because, you know, if it's not going to affect the mother in pregnancy, then when we look at the effect that this is having on females even as well, these estrogenic influences, there have been significant correlations with things like breast cancer.
Yeah.
I mean, premenstrual syndrome is practically the norm among like almost every single female. I mean, you've got polycystic ovaries, you've got all of these different female hormonal disorders, and probably metabolic disorders as well, which are related to estrogen. And so it's, you know, it seems to be affecting everyone. But specifically the role of, aside from the xenoestrogens and these phytoestrogens, I think also is the fact that males are generally so malnourished these days as well. Or I think the whole population, we're particularly in the Western world, we live on a diet predominantly made up of grains and sugar and processed foods, less animal products, and the animal products that we do eat are likely processed and mixed in with all of these grain flours, soy flours, all of this kind of stuff. And that when you look at testosterone, when you look at kind of having a healthy, robust set of sex steroid hormones, one, you need cholesterol. Two, you need zinc, and you need other minerals. You need B6. You need lots of the B vitamins.
Right.
I mean, these things is practically epidemic that these things are really deficient. Because we've moved away from traditional diets. We've had all of the actual nutrition taken out of the diet. And, you know, the grains, the phytic acid, I mean, it's taken half of the zinc. So
yeah.
You know, our ability to actually counteract this, because when you're having all of this estrogenic influence, it's very much anti-testosterone. But if you can kind of boost up your testosterone, then that can somewhat kind of mitigate the effects. It can somewhat displace estrogen. It can somewhat kind of counteract that effect. Yeah. But, you know, if people are generally so bereft of nutrition, then they're going to have a hard time making their own hormones anyway.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably involved as well.
I think it definitely is. Yeah, it definitely is. It's funny that you mentioned grains because, well, actually, I've got a list here of Dr. Anthony J's top list of estrogenics. Dr. Anthony J is a guy, he wrote a book called, what was it called again? Estrogeneration. How estrogenics are making you fat, sick, and infertile. So anyway, he has a list of kind of his top 10 list of estrogenics. So number 1 is the phytoestrogens, like soy, flax, lavender actually is on that list. Cannabis also, oddly, is also on that list. Now, I remember he did kind of say that there are some medicinal effects of cannabis. So obviously every different situation is going to require that you kind of, weigh the good against the bad there. But the one thing that reminded me of this actually, Elliot, is that you mentioned grains, and he was talking about mycoestrogen, which is basically fungus and mold that can have properties, estrogenic properties. And he was saying that grains actually harbor this when they're stored. So when they take grains and they put them in like silos to be stored, it can develop this mold or this fungus that actually has these estrogenic effects. So, we talk a lot about kind of eliminating grains from the diet on this show, and this is actually just yet another reason why that would be a good idea. Number 3 on his list is atrazine. Atrazine is actually one of the most common herbicides used in the US. It's actually, thankfully, banned in most of Europe. I'm not sure where it's at in Canada, but there's actually like a strong correlation between where atrazine is heavily sprayed and where you find the most kind of egregious examples of obesity in the US. It seems like there's you can kind of correlate those very well. Now, you can't necessarily say that that's causation, but certainly it's worth looking into. But atrazine is another xenoestrogen as well. Triclosan and alkylphenols, which are both found in soaps. Triclosan, I think, was banned in the U.S., but they allowed it in some things. One of them being Colgate Total. For some reason, Colgate Total convinced them that having triclosan in their toothpaste, the good outweighed the bad, and that they should be allowed to keep it in there. And the FDA actually agreed with them. So it's for the most part banned, but you can actually, it still is in some products. Benzophenone and 4-methylbenzyliidine camphor. So BP and 4-MBC, those are found in sunscreens. Number 6 on his list was red number 40. So that's the artificial red coloring agent. So you find that in like processed foods, candies, those sorts of things. That's estrogenic as well. Parabens, which are found in fragrances. And unfortunately on the labels of most things, all they ever put is fragrance. They don't actually tell you that parabens are in there. So that can be a difficult one to actually avoid. Phthalates, as we already spoke of, you find it in plastics. BPA is another one that's found in plastics. Yeah, you find it. I think it's another one that's kind of makes the plastic more malleable and things like that. And they've a lot of times the most insidious thing about this is that actually a lot of products will say BPA free on them, but they've actually just started using something called BPS, which is more or less the same thing. So BPA free, they're just using BPS. So you got to watch out for that as well. And the last one that he had on his list, number 10, was the birth control pill, which is EE2 or 17-alpha ethinylestradiol. But yeah, so anyway, that's kind of his list of the top ones. It's certainly not an exhaustive list because there are other xenoestrogens out there. But just from looking at this list and thinking about how many of these things that we're exposed to regularly, daily, hourly, it's kind of scary. So it's not any wonder that we're all turning into ladyboys.
And I mean, you've got that kind of attack on the biological male. Yeah, you've got the attack on our biology, but then at the same time, from all other areas, you've got the kind of, you've got the guilt associated with being male as well. On many other fronts, you've got people or kind of ideologues who have kind of fermented a culture or a way of thinking which kind of views all things male, all things kind of masculine as inherently toxic. Mm-hmm. And as you said, they've kind of taken the caricature of a male, all of those the things that people associate with with bad things: aggression, violence, grouchiness, laziness, selfishness, these kinds of things. And they've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater, almost. I think many people have, because actually when we look at real masculinity, it's got a bad rap. In fact, masculinity, there is a whole other side to that, and it's actually a driving force, and it has been a driving force throughout the history of humanity. In that there are positive attributes that are typically masculine, that are useful adjuncts to society. They are necessary for the growth of a community, of a growth of a family, protecting the family, protecting the loved ones, seeking, kind of putting yourself in danger, risking your life for the ones that you love and care about, for your community, going to war, for instance, against a tyrant to protect the people back at home, building, having the innovation, hunting, going to hunt for the tribe, climbing up a tree for some kind of bounty in a very dangerous situation, having the kind of, the drive to venture into dangerous territory and actually take risks. These are all the masculine qualities which are completely disregarded. And in fact, this is what we seem to have lost: assertion, dominance, but for the good cause, actually saying no when, standing up against tyranny, for instance. And do we see this in today's society?
I mean, no.
No. We see flaccid complacence, virtue signaling, but there's nothing behind it, in that we have spawned or produced a generation, and it's my generation, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I feel it's an unfortunate thing, but my generation is essentially, we lack those qualities, very much so. And actually the ability to speak out, to speak the truth when it needs to be spoken, against things like atrocities being committed, across the world, by US foreign policy and whatnot. People speaking out when they're required to.
I don't think it's I don't think it's just your generation. Certainly, I think it's something that's actually been the complacency seems to have been kind of growing more and more and more as each kind of subsequent generation takes over. And maybe somebody should plot that out against the rise of kind of xenoestrogens, just to see if there's actually a correlation there. But I was just going to go into what do you think an individual can do to kind of help with this? I mean, obviously the best thing to do is to try and avoid exposure to xenoestrogenic things. I mean, don't eat soy would be like kind of the number one. But, avoiding kind of chemicals and things like that, looking for products that are kind of more natural, are using essential oils instead of fragrances, trying to use glass instead of plastic. Like there's a whole culture around like trying to avoid these kinds of toxic things. Understanding, of course, that you can't be perfect. We are literally surrounded by this stuff all the time, but the most you can kind of minimize your exposure, the better. Another thing that we didn't mention actually is that BPA, they actually put those in receipts, in store receipts. I don't think that every store is using receipts that has those in it, but I've seen cashiers actually wearing gloves. I presume it's because of the BPA in the receipts, because you figure if a cashier is handling like hundreds of those a day, and it does actually absorb through the skin. So these are kinds of things for sort of avoiding this kind of stuff. But there's also a few things that you can do to kind of boost testosterone. intermittent fasting actually increases testosterone. It increases testosterone, and it also increases androgen receptor sensitivity. So it actually makes it so that you're not only producing more testosterone, but your receptors are actually more sensitive to the testosterone that you do have. So even if you are kind of exposed to these xenoestrogens, the fact that your receptors are kind of more sensitive to the testosterone that you do have is going to help. Red meat. Red meat is high in carnitine, and carnitine also increases androgen receptor sensitivity. So I think that, the stereotype of the soy boy, that he's like this vegan, I mean, it seems like there's some truth to that. Red meat has carnitine. Red meat increases the receptivity of androgen receptors, or sorry,
red
the
meat has zinc.
Yeah, red meat has zinc.
To make testosterone.
Yeah. Weight training is another good one. It increases free testosterone, and again, helps with androgen receptor sensitivity. And another one I had down here was manganese, because apparently manganese, if you do it in kind of a cycled manner, it will actually release luteinizing hormone releasing hormone, which also helps to increase testosterone. But apparently you do get, what's the word, sensitized to it. It'll stop having as much of an effect after a while. So they say to kind of, Tim Ferriss has a whole protocol on it actually, and apparently you kind of cycle it, and that can be helpful.
Right, I've got a couple of things to add to that. One is actually interesting, phosphatidylserine. So that you see, there's a very kind of strong negative correlation between cortisol and testosterone. So generally, if there is hypercortisolism, so someone is under a state of chronic stress, physiological stress, emotional stress, whatnot, and there's kind of high levels of the stress hormone cortisol, then that will actually have an effect to desensitize the testosterone receptor, so you become actually less sensitive to testosterone. So it can't exert its effects as it would usually. It actually down-regulates the production of testosterone by the Sertoli cells in the testicles. So essentially, it's having multiple different effects at different kind of levels. So it's shutting off feedback, but it's also having a direct effect on the receptor and also an effect on the production of the testosterone. So phosphatidylserine is one of those things. I mean, it's a phospholipid. You find it in small amounts in things like egg yolks and stuff, but this is in quite high dose. Can't remember the dose. I think it's 300 milligrams. 300 milligrams phosphatidylserine once or twice a day. That has been shown to reduce cortisol. So it's what people use when they're like under chronic stress, but it's also been shown to improve testosterone or increase testosterone. There's also zinc, which can be supplemented. I mean, if you're not eating a lot of red meat, I would just eat loads of red meat. But if you're not eating a lot of red meat, then you can actually supplement with a small amount of zinc. I wouldn't go too high because that can kind of cause imbalances with copper. I would stick at like 5 milligrams of zinc once a day. Now that has been shown to improve testosterone generally in most of the studies. There's also another thing which I'm yet to try out, but I'm going to try out very soon, is actually using red or near infrared light. So actually Ben Greenfield and Mike Mutzel, they've both done these experiments, and this has been shown in the clinical research, but it's good to have this kind of firsthand experience, is that actually it's been shown that after 60 days of shining red or near infrared light, and it has to be a proper one, so you want to use one of the kind of good companies to do it. Red or near infrared light shine directly onto the testicles for 15 minutes per day. Increase testosterone once by double, and the other one by triple. So triples and double testosterone. I think it tripled Ben Greenfield's testosterone, doubled Mike Mutzel's, and then in the research generally it's sort of doubles. but that is consistent. So it can have that much of an effect if you do it consistently for at least a month or 60 days. Another thing that, right, just before that, you're talking about what can we do about things like BPA. Yeah, the cash register receipts, it's theorized that actually one of the main sources of exposure may actually be our skin, so transdermal, because it was once thought we absorb loads through the gut, but actually some of it's passed out into the feces, not all of it's absorbed. Whereas when it goes onto your skin, majority of it's absorbed. So, you know, if you're someone who's working at a cash register or something, then yeah, you want to use some gloves or something. But there are some things that you can do, ideally, to actually help your body to detox it. So most of these things are actually lipophilic, which means that they are attracted to your adipose tissue. Okay. So because they're attracted to your adipose tissue, it's safer for you to store them in the adipose. So for instance, you don't want to store them in the organs because it could cause serious damage. Whereas if you store it in the adipose tissue, then it's safely stored away, not very metabolically active, and you can kind of keep it where it needs to be. So what you can actually do is provide your body with the necessary tools to mobilize that. So one of those is going to be sweating. Okay, so sweating is a very effective method to get rid of BPA. Okay, what happens when you raise body temperature? You raise metabolism. When you raise metabolism, you raise the rate at which enzymes start to function. Okay, what this is doing is it is actually liberating all of these lipophilic toxins, all of these lipophilic compounds from your adipose tissue, and they are either going to go into circulation or they're going to go out through the sweat. So when you measure someone's sweat in the research, sweat is a very kind of rich, it's a rich source of metals and BPA and phthalates and all of these plastics. And it shows that your body can effectively get rid of that through the sweat. But then, so for instance, if you can do exercise, you know, try and get really hot, really sweaty. Do a sauna. If you're going to do a sauna, fantastic. But ideally, you want to have a cold shower afterwards or jump into a cold pool. But at some point, you want to be washing your skin off with soap, because that stuff is lipophilic. It means it can be reabsorbed if it stays on your skin. So when you sweat it out, you don't want to reabsorb it. You want to wash it off immediately. Going into some cold water, either in like a cold pool or into a cold shower, what this is going to do is actually going to close off your pores, make it less likely that that stuff is going to be able to absorb very quickly back into your skin. Okay. Furthermore, what you can do is use something like Epsom salts baths. What Epsom salts baths actually do is you're going to get really hot and you're going to get really sweaty. It's going to do the same thing, kind of liberate all of this stuff. But essentially, the Epsom salts baths, you're providing your body with magnesium, but you're also providing a very rich deposit of sulfate, inorganic sulfate, which is a mineral that you're essentially using in one of the phase 2 detoxification pathways in the liver called sulfation. And sulfation is actually one of the ways that you are able to get rid of BPA. BPA can be sulfated, but many of these other things can be sulfated as well. So what you do in the liver is you take the sulfate, you bind it to these toxins, and you carry it out into the bile. Okay, so an Epsom salts bath is fantastic. If you're going to do something like this, you know, sauna, Epsom salts bath, you know, heavy exercise, I would recommend taking some bentonite clay and some charcoal 10 to 15 minutes before, because if you're going to be kind of dumping anything and it's going to potentially be going into the bile, into the gut, then you want to bind that. Okay. What else? BPA. Glutathione is apparently quite good for getting this stuff out as well. So glutathione, bitters and binders. So herbal bitters such as like Swedish bitters. You can use Swedish bitters because what they do is they actually activate the gallbladder to push the bile. So if you're taking something like glutathione, you take that first, you take glutathione. What you're going to do is you're going to kind of prep the liver. You take the bitters to activate liver kind of the bile flow into the gallbladder and gallbladder to flush it into the gut. And then you take a binder sort of half an hour, 40 minutes after, and you're going to bind all of those bile acids, carry it out into the feces. So that's one of the common protocols that they use for getting things like plastics out. But it's a very long process. But yeah, there's lots you can do about it.
Well, it's good.
Yeah. I mean, on that front, that's all that comes to mind. Have you got anything else there to add, Doug?
No.
Anything else you want to talk about?
I think we've covered the soy boy topic.
Yeah. So, in conclusion, it's never good to be a soy boy. Okay, in conclusion, you know, there seems to be a direct link between soy consumption and male feminization and estrogenic factors. There seems also, it's not only soy, it's just a wide variety of chemicals that we're coming into contact with these days. We can't escape them. What we can try to do is boost testosterone, because we know that testosterone is depleted in our modern world. We know that actually, well, there seems to be a correlation between feminization and perhaps many of the kind of things that we're seeing today in society, the way that men are behaving, the lack of kind of real, genuine masculinity, the lack of kind of what some people might describe as, you know, real men, so to speak. It seems like the genders are becoming mixed in many ways. And actually, it seems like that's ultimately manifesting in some cases, at least, as actual transgenderism, because there seems to be some evidence that actually these chemicals, these estrogenic factors in the womb may be having an effect, which is actually kind of producing a bigendered or transgendered kind of physiology. So, yeah, I think that's all for today then, folks. Try and do what you can, lift some weights, avoid the plastics, try to do some of the things that we said, learn about this, and yeah, stay healthy.
Stay healthy.
Yeah. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.
Next week, guys. Bye.